The docking lights of Kestrel 9 flickered as the silver saucer glided into Hangar 12. The station hummed with the usual rhythm of industry until the ship cleared the atmospheric seal. Then, the sound died. Dock workers paused their heavy machinery, leaving the bay in an unnatural, ringing silence. Every eye in the hangar locked onto the faded shamrock and red rose emblems emblazoned on the hull. One worker stood paralyzed, his scanner slipping from numb fingers and shattering into plastic shards on the cold metal floor. No one moved to clean it. The air in the hangar grew heavy with the weight of recognition. They knew the ship. They knew the routes it had carved through the black. The ship groaned as the magnetic locks engaged, the metal plates settling with a final, echoing thud. Steam vented from the underside, swirling across the floor in thick, white plumes that obscured the landing gear. At the center of the hull, the pressurized seal groaned. A sharp mechanical hiss sliced through the quiet, and the hatch began to cycle open. The station waited. The shadows inside the ship were deep, and for a moment, the entire hangar held its breath. Wild Rose stepped onto the metal grating of the platform. She did not hesitate. Her boots struck the floor with a rhythmic, heavy cadence that cut through the lingering silence of the hangar. She moved with the calculated efficiency of someone who had navigated 1,000 worlds, her eyes tracking the exits without ever searching for them. The dock workers remained frozen, but she flowed between them like a current, forcing them to shift their weight and step back just to keep out of her path. She did not look at them. She looked only at the corridor ahead. She moved past the rows of inactive machinery, the echoes of her steps bouncing off the sterile gray walls and filling the vast space. Every movement was precise, devoid of wasted energy. She bypassed the customs office, her hand brushing the doorframe as she pivoted toward the commercial promenade. The station security sensors blinked as she passed, but she ignored the red light. She walked deeper into the station, the distance between her and the ship growing with every stride. The hangar behind her remained silent, but the hum of the station began to return as the workers finally started to breathe again. She kept moving, turning the corner and vanishing into the bustling artery of the promenade. The commercial promenade was a blur of neon and motion, but Rose did not slow. She navigated the crowded thoroughfare with a precision that turned the throng of traders into a parting sea. Ahead, the Wild Rose pub stood anchored in the corner of the sector, looking as if it had been dragged through a nebula and dropped into place. The sign above the door, a neon shamrock, flickered with a rhythmic, dying pulse, casting a sickly green light onto the metal deck. It was a beacon of decay in the sterile perfection of the station. She reached the entrance and stopped. The air here was different. It did not have the filtered, recycled bite of the station's cooling systems. Instead, it pressed against her face with the heavy, layered scent of roasted meat, stale ale, and the sharp, lingering tang of engine oil. It was the smell of 1,000 long nights in deep space. She reached out, her hand finding the handle. The metal was cold and worn smooth by years of use. She took a breath, feeling the weight of the station shift around her, and pushed. The door groaned on its hinges, resisting for a split second before swinging wide to reveal the dim, crowded interior. The transition was absolute, a sudden plunge from the vast, cold vacuum into the suffocating warmth of a life she had once left behind. Rose stepped over the threshold, and the noise died instantly. The clinking of glasses ceased. The low hum of conversation evaporated, leaving only the mechanical buzz of the sign above the door. She stood in the center of the room, the floor vibrating beneath her boots. Every head turned, every eye fixed on her. She did not look at the faces. She scanned the room for the one person she needed to see. Then, the crowd shifted. Bodies pressed against the walls, creating a wide, clear path. Grisnak emerged from behind the bar, moving with a deliberate, measured gait. His 6 eyes locked onto her, scanning her from the floor up, missing nothing. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He reached the center of the room, stopped 3 paces from her, and reached into a pocket. With a sharp, metallic snap, he slammed a datapad onto a nearby table. The screen glowed with a cascade of red numbers and scrolling text. He tapped the glass, his fingers hovering over the data. 18 years of backlog paperwork, Captain, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the weight of nearly 2 decades of silence. Rose looked at the pad, then back at him. Neither moved. The standoff was total. Rose did not break eye contact. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edges of the credit chips. She pulled them out, a heavy stack that caught the dim light, and dropped them onto the datapad with a resonant clatter. The numbers on the screen flickered, recalibrated, and vanished into a steady green glow. Rose leaned back against the bar, the wood creaking under her weight. "How about we settle it with a round for the house?" The silence held for one heartbeat, two, then shattered. A roar erupted from the corners of the room that shook the very foundation of the station. Tables were kicked aside as miners, traders, and travelers surged forward, a tidal wave of noise and motion. Grisnak stared at the credit stack, his 6 eyes widening, then narrowing into a sharp, sudden grin. He vaulted over the counter, closing the distance in a single, fluid leap. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip iron tight, and pulled her into a crushing embrace that knocked the breath from her lungs. The room became a blur of shouting voices and raised glasses. The backlogged years of debt vanished in the sheer volume of the celebration. She was back, and the pub was alive again. The roar of the crowd settled into a steady, pulsing rhythm of shared history. Every corner of the pub became a stage. A veteran miner stood on a stool, waving a half-empty mug as he recounted the time Rose navigated the belt of crystal eels, his hands carving arcs through the air to mimic the creature's bioluminescent glow. The listeners leaned in, their faces illuminated by the flickering wall lights, holding their breath as the story hit its climax. Then, a merchant from the outer rim jumped in, shouting a toast to the blockade run that nearly cost them their cargo, slamming his glass down with such force that the table groaned. Rose remained at the center of it all, moving from group to group, listening as her own life was reconstructed in fragments by those who had witnessed her path. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched engine fuel and stale ale, but the tension was gone, replaced by the electric hum of 1,000 collective memories. Laughter erupted in waves, surging from the back tables to the bar. As one tale bled into the next, she was no longer just a captain. She was a living archive of the sector's most impossible feats, and tonight, every story belonged to the house. Rose backed away from the heat of the crowd, her boots clicking against the metal floor as she slipped through the side door. The heavy latch clicked shut, instantly dampening the roar of the pub into a dull, distant thrum. She stepped onto the balcony, the air here thin and biting. Below her, the station dome arched over the promenade, housing a cluster of artificial stars that drifted in a slow, hypnotic orbit. She gripped the cold railing, feeling the vibration of the station's massive engines deep in her palms. Outside the glass, the galaxy sprawled in an endless, unyielding black, a void that had been her only constant companion for nearly 2 decades. She looked back through the reinforced pane. Inside, the pub was a hive of golden light and movement, a sharp, flickering contrast to the dead expanse surrounding the hall. The laughter reached her as a faint, muffled vibration against the glass. She watched the species mingle, their silhouettes dancing against the backdrop of the bar, and felt the weight of the silence outside press against her chest. The vastness was no longer a destination. It was a ghost she was finally learning to leave behind. Rose pulled the stack of credit chips from her pocket, the heavy, serrated edges pressing deep into her palm. This was the sum of 18 years of narrow escapes and long-haul contracts. She looked out at the dark expanse beyond the glass, where the stars hung like frozen sparks in a void that had demanded everything from her. The silence of the vacuum felt heavy, a gravitational pull toward the horizon she had always chased. She stood there, motionless, as the station lights reflected in the dark pane. If she turned back, the cycle of fuel, navigation, and solitude would start again with the next jump. She looked at the credits, then back at the glass. The dark was infinite, but it was also empty. She tightened her grip until the metal chips bit into her skin, then she turned away from the void. She walked back toward the heavy door, her boots echoing against the metal grating. Each step was a deliberate break from the momentum of her past. She reached the threshold, paused for a heartbeat, and exhaled. The ghost of the galaxy was still there, but she was finished reaching for it. She gripped the handle, pushed the door wide, and stepped back into the warmth of the light. Rose did not head for the bar. She walked straight to the small, raised platform in the center of the pub. She stepped up, the wood groaning slightly under her boots. She reached out and flipped the switch on the local intercom, the system crackling. As it bridged the connection to every sector of the station, she cleared her throat, the sound magnified and echoing through the overhead vents. "I have chased enough fortunes," she announced, her voice steady and projecting across the humming ventilation shafts. "I am staying." She rested her hand on the worn wooden counter of the stage, feeling the grain beneath her fingers. For a second, the pub was deathly quiet. Then, a roar erupted that eclipsed the sound of the station engines. Miners, traders, and travelers surged toward the stage, their voices overlapping into a single, overwhelming wave of sound. The vibration rattled the glasses on the shelves and traveled down through the floorboards, shaking the very hull of the station. It was a thunderous, undeniable affirmation. The station responded to the noise, the lights flickering in rhythmic sync with the cheers. She stood there, anchored in the center of the storm, as the new reality of her life solidified in the roar of the crowd. The roar of the crowd faded into a low, contented murmur as the night deepened. Rose stepped down from the platform and walked behind the bar. She picked up a clean rag, the fabric rough against her calloused palms. With slow, rhythmic movements, she wiped down the surface of the counter, clearing away the rings of spilled ale and the dust of the day. Grisnak stood at the far end, his 6 eyes watching her with a quiet, steady rhythm. She reached for a clean glass, hooked it under the tap, and pulled the handle. The ale flowed, dark and cold, rising to the rim with a soft hiss of foam. She set the glass down and looked up at the transparent dome above. The artificial stars continued their slow, mechanical rotation across the ceiling. The same galaxy she had once navigated, with desperate precision. Now, it was just a backdrop to the quiet hum of the room. She felt the weight of the station beneath her feet, solid and unmoving. A stark contrast to the shifting currents of deep space. She took a breath, the air thick with the scent of roasted grain and oil, and exhaled. The mysteries of the void remained, but they were no longer her concern. She slid the glass across the wood, a small smile touching her face. The shift had begun, and the stories were just beginning.